Well, thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Margo. I guess we'll just dive into the topic. What do you think is at stake with the euthanasia question? And what personally drove you to this topic?
Well, I think that the decision about euthanasia, if you had to choose one decision that would be important, is the single most important decision of the 21st century. And I believe that it is incredibly unwise to legalize euthanasia. And what brought me to that? Well, some more serendipity. My dad was dying of disseminated prostate cancer, and he had metastases to his bones, and he was in terrible, terrible pain, and which, the bone cancer causes. And I got called in Montreal, and they said, if you want to see your dad alive, you better come right now because, he's going to die. So I came back, and I found that, I'm a pharmacist, that they were giving him for medication a liquid that is a mixture of aspirin and morphine. And in order to give him enough morphine to try to control the pain, he got an total overdose of aspirin, which caused him to hallucinate, and it was a mess. And I went berserk, and they got in a pain specialist, a wonderful man, called Michael Cousins. There were very few pain specialists in these days, and Michael fixed my dad and got his pain under control. And my dad said to me, I want to live as long as I can, but I don't want to live if I've got to live in this pain. And he said, Margo, it was wonderful that you could come back and do something about it. But he said, not everybody has got a daughter who can go berserk and turn a hospital upside down and get something fixed, So he said, you've got to do something for other people. So what that did, it caused me to write a paper that I called Death of Pain. And what I argued was that we want to kill the pain, but not the person with the pain. And that was published in the McGill Law Journal in 1980. No, actually, it was the University of Toronto Law Journal, but it doesn't matter, in 1980. And as a result of that paper, because what I argued was that there is a fundamental human right not to be negligently left in pain, and that healthcare professionals have a human obligation to relieve pain in people. And as a result of that article, which was sort of the first suggestion at the time of the human rights approach, I got invited to give the opening speech for the International Association for the Study of Pain conference in La Défense in Paris, about 18 months after I wrote this article. And then out of that came what's now called the Declaration of Montreal, which has been ratified by the World Medical Association, by the World Health Association, I think by the UN General Assembly. And so, that was really important. And then you can see that there'd be a natural connection with, well, now, okay, let's take the next step and legalize euthanasia, and I think that is an incredibly bad idea. And so I then had to step in and say that relief of pain is not euthanasia. Refusal of life support treatment is not euthanasia, but fully adequate pain management is a human right. And if you know what you're doing, you can do that without killing the patient. And one of the big problems that we've got, and this is a problem that euthanasia is causing, that quite a lot of people, minimum 30% of people who are dying in Canada, are being offered euthanasia, but not being offered palliative care. And we know, which of course a major element of palliative care is fully adequate pain management. And we know that when people get that, like my dad, they don't want to die. They just don't want to be in pain. So that's why I got involved in this. And it's been a huge amount of work, and it's not going away, much to my consternation. And a lot of people say that the US has euthanasia. The US doesn't. It's got assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide, but that is a form of euthanasia, but it's not strictly, it's not euthanasia. But that doesn't mean I agree with it. I mean, I don't think we should have doctors killing people or helping people to kill themselves. And so this is helping somebody to kill themselves, which is the assisted suicide. And I think I sent you some of the Canadian statistics, which are completely amazing. In 2022, there were about 14, I haven't got the exact number, but it was plus or minus a few, 14,500 cases of what they call MAID, medical assistance in dying, which is both euthanasia and assisted suicide, and the patient can choose which they want. And of the 14,500, 7 were assisted suicide, and the rest of them were all euthanasia, the doctor giving the person a lethal injection. So I think one of the things we have to ask is, why is there that incredible discrepancy? Do these people not really want to die, and that they've got some instinct against killing themselves? But if the doctor does it, it seems like a nice, controlled, clean medical act. And indeed, one of the strong arguments for the people used for euthanasia is that it is just another form of medical treatment. And I think that's wrong too. It's not medical treatment. In fact, a colleague of mine, Professor Don Boudreau, and I wrote a paper called Euthanasia is Not Medical Treatment that is available on the web. And I think it's in the, I get mixed up where my papers are published, but I think that one's in the British Medical Bulletin. And it was solicited by them. They asked us to write it. So.
Well, thank you for that. So we've been hearing Canada is one of the places that allows for euthanasia. Globally, I mean, are there a lot of countries that are allowing for euthanasia? What's the big picture state? What countries do allow it currently?
I had a list. There's only 6 countries that allow euthanasia properly, so-called. Originally, it was in the Netherlands, then Belgium, Canada, Luxembourg, Australia, which is very sad. I tried to persuade them not to do it, but the politicians want to get these things off their books, particularly if there's an election coming, and Colombia most recently. Colombia's noted for its drug addiction, and now it's got euthanasia. So,
is this picking up steam? Do you think there's a trajectory that this is getting bigger and bigger worldwide, or do you think these are mostly isolated cases and this isn't exploding as a global issue?
Oh, it's certainly picked up speed, and the use of it in the countries where it is legal, on average, the number of cases goes up 30% a year. The prediction for 2024, or maybe 2023, I think, is that, for example, in Canada, there will be more than 16,000 individual cases. That's 16,000 in a year. And the overall total of cases since euthanasia was legalized in Canada will be over 60,000. So what you're looking at is doctors and nurse practitioners who are also allowed to do it in Canada will now have killed over 60,000 patients. And the other thing is there's been articles written about how it's a cost-saving measure. We on average, the average person uses half of their total healthcare costs for their life in the last 6 months of their life. And there was an article published in the New England Journal called Squaring the Curve. Instead of going slowly downhill like this in the last 6 months where you're costing a lot, what you would do is you'd go like, there you're reasonably well up here, and then off the chart with euthanasia. And it was estimated at the time, and this was several years ago, and when there wasn't such a high rate of euthanasia in Canada, that it would save the Canadian healthcare system around $150 million a year. Now, that's very attractive to politicians, and you've also got to keep in mind that in the West, we are rapidly aging societies. And there's lots of examples in Canada where people who are over a certain age, that there's an attitude among some healthcare professionals, well, euthanasia might be the best thing. And it's an issue of whether healthcare professionals are allowed to suggest to a patient that they could have euthanasia, or whether that is prohibited. In Australia, there's a mixed approach to that because euthanasia laws, so-called VAD here, which is voluntary assisted dying, vary from state to state. And some states prohibit raising it. The patient has to raise the issue. Others don't prohibit it. So, and people with disabilities are really scared of this. I'm on a group in Canada, and it's called VPS, Vulnerable Person Statement on Euthanasia. And they have been fighting it because they say that, people with disabilities are at high risk of people suggesting to them, you'd be better off dead. Not that they put it in those terms, but essentially that's the message that's being communicated.
So in the countries where euthanasia is becoming a prominent thing, is this primarily for extreme cases, or is it much wider?
What patients, Jonathan?
What are the conditions that someone has to meet to be eligible for euthanasia? Is it only extreme cases, or is it broader than that?
Much broader than that. Again, of course, it varies. The Netherlands is currently looking at if you're over 70 and you can convince a committee that you're tired of life or that you feel that you have a completed life, then you should be allowed to have euthanasia. And in Canada, the law started off that death had to be reasonably foreseeable, that is, natural death. And that was challenged by the pro-euthanasia lobby, and a court held that was unconstitutional because it discriminated on the basis of disability between people who had a disability, that they could get euthanasia, and people who didn't have a disability couldn't get euthanasia, and that was wrong. So in other words, not having a disability was a discrimination on the basis of disability. As well as that, the Canadian Supreme Court held that prohibiting euthanasia was a breach of the constitutional right to life. Now, you could hardly imagine how could that be? How could giving somebody the right to have euthanasia be only if their death was foreseeable, be a breach of the right to life? Well, what the court held was that if you had a disease where you knew you were going to get worse and you didn't want to, and because you got worse, let's say one of the neurological diseases, you couldn't commit suicide without assistance, then to prohibit suicide assistance shortened your life because you would have to commit suicide while you were still able to do so, and you wouldn't live that extra life that you would have lived if you knew you could have assistance. So it's, it's been a legal minefield, as you can imagine.
So with this being an area that we've been shifting on in the last few decades, and it's becoming a broader thing globally, what are the philosophical backgrounds and presuppositions that are allowing this to become a plausible conversation? What's shifting in Western society that this becomes plausible to us today?
I think it's very complex, as I'm sure you know, Jonathan. There's no one factor, but one of them is the loss of a shared religion, and indeed the loss of religion itself, and the major increase in family breakdown, the incredible increase in people living alone, and the implications of that are very broad. I mean, just yesterday, there was a discussion on Australian Broadcasting Commission, ABC, about what are we going to do about homelessness, because we've got all these people with no homes in Australia. And one of the factors that was discussed is that people don't live with other people anymore. Each one person has a home. And so therefore there's a lot of people homeless because they haven't got any close relatives or family or, shared accommodation and that. And what we know is that, and I've been struck by this since the beginning, it is the most common kind of requirement of people to say, I don't want to die alone. We want compassionate, loving accompaniment when we're dying. People say things like, I want somebody to be holding my hand. And that's interesting because we know that when people are dying, the last sense that they lose is touch. They can lose sight and hearing. Touch is the last one. And also with societies where we don't count if we're just a human being, we have to be a human doing. What are you doing? You think about when you meet somebody, most commonly, meet them for the first time, they say, what do you do? And you don't say, I'm a human being. That's what I do, being a human being. But you say, well, I'm a professor of bioethics, or I'm a philosopher, or I'm a whatever. And so when you lose that identity, and I think this is particularly true for men, because for women to some extent, although becoming less, being a mother and having children, even though it's a lesser part of women's role now, it's still a very important part. And I think it's coming in for men, that men actually want that more than they did in the past. I mean, as long as you were a good provider, you didn't have to do all the cuddling and hugging and sympathizing with the kids. That was your wife's job. And all of those things are contributing to this. And I think as well, I've had a big emphasis on that we can't live without hope. And a journalist once asked me what was the favorite line I'd ever written. And I knew immediately without thinking, it's hope is the oxygen of the human spirit. Without it, our spirit dies. With it, we can overcome even seemingly insurmountable obstacles. And what the palliative care people are showing in their research, and Dr. Harvey Chochinov is one of these people, is that that you can have hope even when you are dying if you feel that you're leaving a legacy for the future. And so he's a psychiatrist who specializes in psychiatry of dying people. And he devised this treatment called dignity therapy. And essentially it's giving people what I've called mini hopes. You can't have a hope for 10 years from now, but you can have a hope that tomorrow something good or nice will happen. And that's enough, perhaps. You can have a hope. I'm pretty much an animal fan, and so you can have a hope that the hospital dog was what I meant to say, is going to come and see you, and you can cuddle that dog. And I know of one hospice where they've got a hospice cat that lives in the hospice. I'd like that. I've got a Bengal cat here. And so, it's a very complicated situation. I think one thing I'd like to mention, because you asked me, is, are everybody going to do this? It is an issue in postmodern Western democracies. It is rejected, for example, in Africa, and here in Australia, as an example. On the whole, First Nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples completely rejected, completely. And I know that in Canada, the First Nations of Canada, the original people, have rejected it. At one point, they threatened that if Quebec legalized euthanasia, they would separate from Quebec in northern Quebec. And, Quebec's always talking of separating from Canada. And so they said, well, if Quebec can separate, we can separate from them. So, who knows?
Well, I can imagine. Thank you so much for all of that, and particularly the sense that hope. I think it was ironically Nietzsche that said, "The person who has a why to live can endure anyhow."
And it was repeated by Viktor Frankl in his book.
Yeah.
Because someone asked Viktor Frankl, how did you help people in in Auschwitz? Oh, I find that really awful. Think of that. And he said, if you can give people a why to live, they can always find a how. And I think that's true in relation to euthanasia. Palliative care gives people a why to live from day to day, and essentially that why has got some hope. Has got hope in it that there will be something good in tomorrow, even though there's bad in tomorrow.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And building off this question of why, having a why to live, I've heard that in a lot of contexts, it's not just physical pain that might be being considered, for euthanasia. It's also, I've heard some contexts have talked about it as a possibility for the homeless, or for people who have this sort of existential depression, or even people potentially in their 20s who don't have physical pain, but who can't sort of find a justification to go on for sort of reasons of, I can't find a why to make this life worth enduring. Is that, am I correct that that's part of the equation that this is being expanded
important.
to?
At the moment, again, taking Canada as the example, because Canada is the most extreme example of euthanasia in the world, which is, amazing when you think about it. They have legislated to allow a person with no physical illness, but serious mental illness, that would qualify them for euthanasia. And originally the law has been passed, but it has not been activated. It's got to be signed off by the Governor-General to become an enforceable law. And originally it was supposed to have come into operation on the 17th of March this year, St. Patrick's Day. And there's been such a campaign to try to stop it, that the government would change that date, and it's now March 2027. But there's a psychiatrist in the US called Dr. Mark Conrad, and he has been a real force in trying to stop this. And the way he put it was that what that law would do is convert psychiatrists who are supposed to prevent suicide into providers of suicide, because you would have to have a psychiatrist who certified you had an incurable mental illness. And one of the arguments there, which has been very powerful, is that you cannot, because what the pro-euthanasia people argue, the advocates, they argue that a physician-assisted suicide in the context of it being euthanasia is not suicide. It is simply another medical treatment, and it should not be labelled as suicide. And so what the psychiatrists who did not want psychiatrists killing people, what they argued to the Canadian government was that you could not distinguish ordinary garden variety suicide from this medical suicide, that they were indistinguishable, and that therefore there would be a lot of people you'd have a new category of suicide, which would be suicide by doctor, which would be like suicide by police. Do you know about suicide by police? It's where you've got someone. We just had a case here in Sydney on Saturday night. You have somebody who does something outrageous but they're suicidal, but they don't want to kill them. They can't kill themselves for some reason, and they do something that the police will shoot them. And this guy leapt on a policeman in the main Central Hyde Park in Sydney, and he had a kitchen knife and stabbed a policeman several times in the head. And of course, what the police actually did was taser him. But there's been several other cases here. In recent weeks, we've got a murder by knife epidemic in Sydney, and where these people, they've all been men, have attacked people with knives and have been shot by police. Now, you don't know what that is. It's obviously the person's not normal, but what to do about it. It's very difficult. And so we had one about 4 or 5 weeks ago where 6 people were killed by a man with a knife in a major shopping centre at Bondi Beach, which everybody's heard about mainly. So anyway, that's,
Yeah.
And what you have to think about is, we've always got sick and we're going to die, and often, we're suffering. And none of us want to suffer ourselves, nor do we want other people to suffer. And where we can all agree, and I'm a big advocate of starting from agreement, because it gives you an experience of belonging to the same moral universe. And then when you differ and you have conflict, that conflict has a different tone if you've had that experience of being in agreement before you are in serious disagreement. And where in the euthanasia debate we are all in agreement is none of us want people to suffer. Where we disagree is what is a legitimate means to relieve that suffering. And if you're anti-euthanasia, you say euthanasia is not a legitimate means. If you're pro-euthanasia, you say, yes, it is a legitimate means. So euthanasia is not about will we die. It's about how we will die. We're all going to die. But the issue is how are we going to die?
Well, for our listeners who might not be on the same side of this issue as you, would it be all right if I think I'm just going to ask you some difficult questions and give you a chance to kind of present your case for those people? I guess in this sense, I'm going to be playing devil's advocate for the sake of the conversation. I can imagine someone saying, "This is my pain. It's my own personal, private decision how I handle it. Not yours, not society's, not anyone else's." How might you respond to something like that?
Humans are not isolated atoms. We are social animals, and what any one of us does, particularly in something as important as having yourself killed, affects others. You can't avoid that. And we also desperately need relationships and good relationships. Actually, it's interesting. The feminists have a doctrine that they call relational autonomy, that you don't just have to, because what you argued there was actually a radical autonomy approach, that this is my life, my body, it's nobody else's business, certainly not the state's business to pass laws to prohibit me doing what I want to my own body. And also that intense autonomy view is only in the present. You look at the individual and you look in the present. But when you look back, if you go, that's an essential inquiry. It's very important to know what that person wants from their own autonomy and what their present circumstances are. But then when you go to the collective human memory and you say, why for thousands of years have civilized societies prohibited intentional killing, and even more so prohibited doctors and medical people from intentionally killing their patients? What were they protecting against, and why don't we need that now? Well, the answer is we still need that. And so it's the risk and harm, especially to vulnerable people, that you are opening up with legalizing euthanasia. I mean, now, for example, Canada's looking at whether it should be available to children. And babies, newborn babies that have got serious disabilities are already euthanized in the Netherlands, and I think in Belgium too. And so, and then the other thing you've got to do is you've got to look forward about, if we do this, where is it likely to lead? And when the whole euthanasia debate started in Canada, and we're talking here probably 2012. And because I was in bioethics and because I was at McGill University, and because I was on the radio or the television or whatever, and because I was writing articles, I was a target. And somebody set up a debate where I debated the head of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Quebec, a doctor called Dr. Guy Robert, who was a big promoter of euthanasia. And he thought that it should be legalized in Quebec and, that's what they should do. And in this debate, I said to him, this can't be controlled if you legalize it. You will have a huge number of cases. And he got up and replied that there would never be more than 100 cases a year. And then he sort of thought about it and he said, well, maybe if in an extreme there could be 200 cases a year, it will never be out of control. It will be a rare intervention only used in the most extreme cases. Well, 60,000 cases is a long way from 200. And I had this irresistible urge to say, I told you so, but, that's not appropriate. But Quebec now...
I'm sure it would help our views if you said, I told you so, because everyone...
Quebec, I just found this out very recently, now has the highest number of deaths by euthanasia of the total number of deaths each year in the world. So, and I don't know whether he changed his mind. Short after the first year of legalized euthanasia in Quebec, and it's interesting, Quebec does not allow assisted suicide. It only allows lethal injections. And I think they probably did that not to give approval to suicide as a means of relieving suffering, because you see, that's what physician-assisted suicide does. But anyway, after the first year figures came out, and they were way higher than anybody expected, but they weren't anything like they are now, he wrote an article, it's in French, and it was called La Mort à la carte. And that translates as death on the menu. You could, and what I have just read in an article is that euthanasia in Canada is no longer an unusual intervention. It is just another option of how to die. And I sent you a poem that I wrote about where the man knocked... I was in British Columbia, which is called the euthanasia capital of Canada, in Victoria, because it's where people go to either get married or die. It's got a very old population because it's warm, or a lot warmer in the winter than the rest of Canada. So if you're old and you want to avoid the cold and you want to stay in Canada, you go to Victoria. And this old man had decided he was going to be euthanized that afternoon. And another neighbor knocked on the door I was staying with friends. And this man, I answered the door and he said, I just want to let you know that Bert is leaving us this afternoon. So if you want to say goodbye to him, the neighbors are all coming in this morning to say goodbye. And I kind of can't imagine. Not easy, Jonathan.
Yeah. I'm actually from Vancouver, British Columbia, and we have multiple family friends who have taken this route in the last few years. So it's very, very personal, and it impacts the... Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it disrupts. I've actually been called in to try to mediate a very serious conflict among family members. And in fact, in one of these cases, the two daughters were in favor of their mother being euthanized and the son wasn't. And, but the son and a woman Church of England priest who's a friend of mine, who I don't think she's not anti-euthanasia exactly, but I think she thinks it's got to be carefully controlled. They were terribly psychologically injured because the mother wanted everybody to be present when she was actually euthanized, and they were completely traumatized by it. And I have a close friend in Montreal whose partner who was a doctor, and the day he got diagnosed with cancer, he called in another friend to euthanize him that night, and my friend in the room, and she said she couldn't stay there, and we were in a restaurant having lunch, and she burst into tears and kept saying in a very loud voice, it was horrible, and it was sort of caused a bit of a stir in the restaurant, this crying woman saying it's horrible, and so it's traumatic. It's not. It's, this idea that you slip off peacefully into the eternal. This simply isn't necessarily true. And sometimes the euthanasia goes wrong, and I don't know whether they still have it, but when I was in Quebec, in the euthanasia kit, which the government sends out to the doctors who want to carry out euthanasia, they had medications and instructions of what to do if the euthanasia went wrong. And the person didn't slip peacefully off into the night, And the latest bizarre thing I've read about was that a man was going to use assisted suicide and had the lethal medication. It was a liquid, and his best friend was with him, and the best friend decided to try the medication to see what it tasted like, and they rushed him off to hospital. So,
well, building on some of the stories you've just shared, is there a fundamental difference between euthanasia and, say, removing someone from life support? And if so, why is that a crucial difference? Because I think a lot of people have removed family members from life support and haven't necessarily found it to be the traumatizing experience you just described. How is it fundamentally different in your perspective?
Because the difference is, first of all, one difference is the intention of the person who's either giving the lethal injection or removing the life support. And in the lethal injection, the primary intention is to inflict death on the person. In removal of life support, the primary intention is not to inflict death, it's to allow the person to die a natural death. If there is no underlying cause for death, the person won't die when you remove the life support. In fact, that's what happened in an early famous case in the US. It was a young woman. She was comatose. She'd been on life support for a long time. And there's some syndrome, I think they call it pickup syndrome, where your brain respiratory mechanism can compensate for damage to the primary one. And finally, I think it was Mary Ann Quinlan case. I can't remember exactly the name of it. But anyway, when they took the life support away, it was respiratory support. she started breathing on her own. And she didn't die. I think it was about another 10 years until she died. And so in taking away life support, first of all, there's no intention to inflict death. There is an intention to allow natural death to occur if that is on the cards, but you're not inflicting it. That person is just dying in the same way that every other person dies. That your whole integrated body system can no longer sustain life. And so it's very different. And I think we understand that, and that's why we don't have the same trauma. It can be traumatic, of course. Losing anybody you love is traumatic, but it's not caused by the removal of the life support. It's caused by the loss of the person who dies a natural death. And the other thing about that is that there is now some research on what is the impact on healthcare professionals who are involved in euthanasia, and it can be quite severe mental injury. And there was an example in Ontario where the Ontario government, I think it was, had a list that doctors could sign up for, and that said they were willing to carry out euthanasia if people were needing a doctor who would do that. And then they found after a while that some doctors were taking their names off the list, and that somebody went to speak to these doctors to ask them why were they taking their names off. And a lot of them said, we did it once and we couldn't do it again. You see, it's antithetical to the whole zeitgeist of medicine, that the Hippocratic Oath, 2,500 years, we cure where possible, we care always, we never cure.
Thank you for sharing. Sorry, go ahead.
I had a student. We make our medical students do what's called a dissertation. They've got to take a contentious legal issue, and they've got to give 3 reasons that they could be wrong on the side that they take. Then they've got to put out what their position is, and then they've got to answer the 3 reasons that are against them. And the young woman who gave a brilliant presentation, and we have a prize for the best disputation of the year, and we've got an honour board where the student gets their name forever in gold on the honour board, properly done. And the young woman who won it this year, or last year actually, because it's held at the end of the bioethics program, she argued for no freedom of conscience for doctors in regard to euthanasia. That if it's a legal treatment and you decided to register as a legally practicing doctor, you've got an obligation to provide all legally allowed treatments. And of course, that's completely the opposite of what I think. But I was one of the judges, and I supported her winning the prize. But when they present, all of the other students and the professors are allowed to question, because we only choose 3 presenters out of this year 165 medical students. So, even to get to present is a big deal. And the question I asked her was, would you trust a doctor who would act against his or her conscience? And in other words, you've got a doctor who thinks that euthanasia is wrong, but you're going to force them to provide it. Would you trust that doctor? And one of the other things, which I think is heinous, is that the pro-euthanasia lobby are arguing that medical students should not be allowed to graduate unless they've carried out a case of euthanasia. It's just horrific to think that somebody would require that.
Well, you've brought up a lot of the suffering and trauma of doctors who put people through this process, and also the pain and suffering of those who've had to watch their family members be euthanized. I wonder if the other side could say something to the effect of, well, it's quite traumatic and horrible to watch a family member have to suffer and not be able to allow them to be put out of their misery. And it's quite hard on the family, it's quite hard on the doctors, and of course it's quite hard on the person. And that they would say, even if this goes against some of our instincts, perhaps we should deny some of those instincts out of compassion for what's best for that person. So I guess this would be the compassion argument. How would you respond to that? And how would you provide a framework for how you can still be compassionate even if you're not for euthanasia?
It's a very good observation, Jonathan. People who are against euthanasia definitely have to deal with that. And the clear answer is fully adequate, high-class palliative care, because there is no suffering that cannot be relieved. There is a procedure which can be used as euthanasia, but need not be euthanasia. And what it is that you sedate the person so that they're not conscious of the suffering. If you can't relieve it in any other way, you can put them in, give a light general anesthetic, and they're not conscious of that suffering, and they can be calm. And again, you've got that same principle that you asked me about taking away the respirator. Your intention there is not to inflict death with the sedation. It is to relieve the suffering, and what you are doing is reasonably necessary to relieve that suffering. Now, why that can be euthanasia is that if what you're doing is intended to inflict death, that you are giving a massive dose of something that would inflict death, and far more than is necessary to relieve the suffering. And there was a case in Canada where a pediatrician was giving babies massive doses of, these were babies born with congenital disabilities, and giving massive doses of morphine to these babies so that the baby's respiration dropped and they died. And but when you look at what is used for the sedation, what drug is used, and you look at the person's situation, and you look at what dose is given, and you look at how it's monitored in that, you can tell the difference between whether it's palliative sedation, which is not euthanasia but is good palliative care, as compared with terminal sedation, when you're using euthanasia, when you're using sedation to carry out euthanasia. I know you asked me about the paper I wrote about the combination of euthanasia and organ transplantation, or recovery of organs for transplant, because that fits in there too.
Well, so you've kind of made the claim that there's basically no pain that can't be treated palliatively, as you said. Do you see any exceptions at all? So, for example, in the abortion case, even pro-lifers might make an exception if, say, both the child and mother will die unless the abortion goes through. Are there any equivalent cases for you that are equivalent exceptions for euthanasia? Cases that are just so extreme that no amount of drugs or any sort of care can compensate, and perhaps in this one instance, euthanasia might be allowed?
My answer to that, the one that has always kind of tripped me up, is the dying soldier who's mortally wounded and, in the field, and you can't get him out, and you are a medic in the midst of battle. What would you do? I find it very difficult to say that you shouldn't give a lethal injection in that case, but maybe there's some other way that you can monitor that. But I guess the other thing is that I wouldn't say that euthanasia should be legalized in order to deal with that case. Rather, there are always exceptions in the law, and I would treat that as an exception. Actually, it's interesting because there's currently a big fuss in Australia about some Australian special unit soldiers who might have intentionally killed Afghan people when Australia was involved in the Afghan war. And one of these soldiers has been, given the highest medals of courage and decoration and everything. And now I think it's a court-martial going on to look at, was this a willful killing that was completely contrary to the rules of war and regarding people taken prisoner and that. And and in the law, you can have things that are wrong and illegal, but you don't, for other reasons, you excuse them. And there's a difference between excusing something and approving of it. And I think there are cases where we can understand an excuse. Again, I've written an article on this that's called, I can't remember the first bit of it. Oh, it's called Medical Interventions and the Criminal Law, Lawful or Excusable Wounding. And because originally, all surgery was the crime of maim or mayhem, to maim somebody. Any breaking of the full 3 layers of skin was the crime of maim. Now, how then could the surgeon, what I ask the students is, like, we're on the corner of Oxford Street and Victoria Street, the medical school. On the other corner is a very famous Sydney hospital, St. Vincent's Hospital, very, very old, founded by the nuns, now a major hospital, major research institute. So I say to the students, now, if you walk out and you stand on the corner of the medical school and you stab somebody in the back, like been happening here in Sydney, what do you think is going to happen to you? You will be immediately, the police will charge you if the person dies, it's first-degree murder. Okay, cross the road and go into the operating room in St. Vincent's, and you're going to stab somebody in the back because they're having surgery. What's going to happen to you? Nothing. I hope everything's going to go well. The person's going to be grateful. So what is the difference? And the difference is your intention, the situation in which you do it, why you are doing it. So all of these things count. And I just don't think you can justify euthanasia. You can't justify it. And I guess I wonder whether on the battlefield, I would say perhaps that wasn't euthanasia, but it is. Because I think to leave somebody to die in pain is absolutely terrible. I was going to have euthanasia for anyone, I'd have it for the person who did that.
Well, I appreciate your willingness to enter into the nuances and be open about this difficult example. And I think just as a closing question, I think with these questions around euthanasia and death and suffering, I think my last question is, do you have any closing thoughts on what it means to finish the race well?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, what I would like, I read just in the last few days about somebody, I can't remember who it was, who wrote his last column for, I think it was the New York Times. And it wasn't a sudden drop dead death. He knew he was dying, but he wrote it on the afternoon before the morning on which he died. And I think that's good. That's finishing the race well. And I think also, it's interesting because it's work, isn't it? It's like saying you finish the race well if you can work up until the point at which you die. But I think it's also extremely important, and we've got to do something about this in our society, that people don't die lonely. And, the Brits have now got a minister for loneliness in their parliament. And certainly here in Australia, there's a great deal of concern about loneliness. And there's research going on that, if you're lonely, you're more likely to have a heart attack. So a broken heart is not, just a metaphor. It might in fact be real. And, and I think the other thing is, and this is part of Harvey Chochinov's dignity therapy, that he gets people to recall what they think were the good things in their life and what they contributed, and a lot of people, and they write it down, and or they have someone who takes notes, and then it's typed up, and the person is allowed to read it and correct it, and and that is bound as a little book to be given to the family members after the person dies. And one of the people who did this agreed to be a research subject, he was dying. At the end of it, he said that had been the best 2 weeks of his life. And, it's sad. And I guess we've got to, I'm being a bad demonstration of it this morning, but we've got to get in touch with our emotions, with our moral intuitions. You see, I believe that we have multiple ways of human knowing, and that we've got to allow all of them to operate, and nowhere more essentially than in the context of death and how we should handle death, both personally and as societies. And if you look at the pro-euthanasia case, it's very logical, cognitive, bare bones. It says, it's the shorthand for it is, you're going to die anyway. It doesn't matter if you die by euthanasia. That's as good as any other way. I don't think that's true. And so we will see. But I'm certainly on the losing side at the moment.
Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe below, or to check us out on Spotify. And if you want to hear more from this week's episode or guest, our Patreon account has exclusive unaired content, often featuring up to an hour of additional footage and interviews for each episode. We save some of the most controversial and pulse-pounding topics just for our Patreon members. Members get access to that, plus the chance to meet monthly with Jonathan and I. suggest episode topics, join us live for an episode to ask the special guests questions, or even get a personalized episode custom made just for you. Check out our Patreon link in the description below. And don't forget to check out our official website at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com to see what else you're missing out on. Sound effects from Zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.